Let's go back to last Sunday. Give us a sense of your immediate reaction to the fall of Kabul following the US withdrawal.
Well, horror really, because we didn't have to be in this position, and we some of us had warned that it was possible. I remember speaking initially on the radio on the 2nd of July, but getting no traction anywhere, and I'm sure others were doing the same. I remember my old colleague Peter. It's very good to be on a program with you, Peter.
Hi.
Also around that time, saying similar things. But as soon as the decision was taken by Joe Biden, I'm afraid the morale within the Afghan armed forces collapsed, and the end was inevitable. That said, the speed of the advance was, I think, faster than even seasoned hands like me had anticipated. I'd given it until mid-September, and I was out by about 3 weeks. So yeah, horror, unnecessary. But now let's focus on what we're going to do about it.
Peter, would you share that assessment?
Yes, I would. Certainly, we've got to now focus on what we do about it. It has been a humiliating period for the UK. I'm afraid we've learned that Joe Biden has put US politics ahead of NATO alliance solidarity, and Britain hasn't counted for much in that decision or anything at all. And now, as you said in the bulletin, as David says, it is a dangerous situation around the airport. I think the British military and civilian crisis management effort to get people out has been impressive in the circumstances. They're getting out about 1,000 people a day, but it's obviously a nightmare around the airport. And there is this risk, of course, of a terrorist atrocity there, something which, of course, the Taliban would hate as well. And so, in a way, the Taliban are our allies in trying to prevent that happening.
And Peter, you were chair of the Joint Intelligence Committee under Prime Minister Tony Blair. He's in the Mail today calling Joe Biden an imbecile. Obviously, this has been a hugely challenging time for UK-US relations. Would you share his assessment?
Well, Tony Blair is never one to understate his argument, is he? And he puts it in very, very stark terms. Has been a humiliating time. Tony Blair, of course, was the one who led us into Afghanistan in 2001, and he, like so many others, including David, feels this humiliation of all that British effort and lives lost. I mean, but the hard fact is we are going to need to continue to work with the Americans in all sorts of areas. And this has been a difficult experience. We need to bring the Americans back to working with their allies, taking account of our views. But we can't somehow invent a foreign policy without the Americans. So we've got to take a deep breath and do some frank talking to Joe Biden and then get back to work with him.
Lord Richards, where does this leave the West more generally? Where does it leave NATO? Because, of course, if the Americans are taking a step back, that seems to have consequences for foreign policy everywhere, really.
Well, I think, as Peter's suggesting, this was the president's calculation that we are so sadly, in many respects, and this is a result of many defence cuts over many years, as with the rest of European members of NATO, we are pretty neutered without the Americans. And we just have to accept it. And I think that was, as I say, in their calculation. There's lots of things that we will now have to take a closer look at. NATO, what is it actually for? The tilt to the Far East, the sending of the carriers to sort of push away the Chinese threat in some way, or to join those that wish to do so. I've always been opposed to. I think we should focus on NATO and the nearer abroad, if you like, along with our NATO allies. That's just one example of the sort of fresh look at our geostrategy, if you could grace it with that term at the moment, that we need to look at. But I just like to emphasize that Afghanistan and what we do in the next few weeks will also be central to our reputation. We could salvage a little bit out of Afghanistan, working, some people will find it difficult, but working with the Taliban to prevent the thing we all went in initially to make sure wouldn't happen again, which is a re-emergence in all that ungoverned space of terrorist groups that will most certainly be planning right now to have another go at the West as soon as they can.
And what would that look like practically? What sort of measures would make that happen?
Well, I think there's a case for an international humanitarian relief operation. The UN should do it. They haven't got a great record for doing things quickly, but when necessary, they can do it. And if the major permanent members of the UN got behind them, that is a possibility. We would turn what we're doing today, along with other nations, into a blue beret operation. And ironically, I think the Taliban might welcome it, because as Peter was hinting, the alternative is further chaos and reputational damage to the Taliban at a time when, quite clearly, whether we believe all their claims or not, they wish to avoid that. And there's no great love amongst the Taliban leadership for groups like ISIS. So we can make a marriage of convenience here to solve the immediate humanitarian crisis and actually demonstrate that we can work together and need to work together as we go forward into other crises which inevitably will come our way.
And Peter, let's go back to how this happened in the first place. A lot of words from Joe Biden, also from Boris Johnson, saying that nobody saw this coming. You obviously chair of the Joint Intelligence Committee. You have a background in security. Why did we not see this coming? Did we not have the intelligence? Was it on the ground but not listened to by people higher up?
Well, I think as soon as Donald Trump negotiated a deal with the Taliban in early 2020, which basically told them that the American forces were leaving anyway, and the only condition that was sought from the Taliban was that they wouldn't allow Afghanistan territory to be used as a base for terrorist attacks, then the clock was ticking on the Afghan regime and the Afghan security forces, because you can't expect the Afghan security forces to manage on their own with a sudden American pullout. The numbers of Americans was small, but their deterrent value, given that the entire weight of the American military machine was sort of there in the background behind them, that was extremely large. So that, I think, knocked the stuffing out of the regime. Then Joe Biden's decision to push ahead with a very rapid pullout by a symbolic date in American terms of the 11th of September, I think was the final straw. So it was predicted that we would find the Taliban coming back to power. I think, as David Richards rightly said, the speed at which it happened wasn't. And that is the most difficult thing with intelligence, I think, to predict not just facts, but states of mind, morale. It's very hard to predict what will be the trigger that leads to the collapse. I mean, it certainly took everyone in Afghanistan by surprise, and us as well. So, of course, there are lessons here about maintaining our intelligence capacity, about thinking ahead, and also, I think, for Britain, about our soft power. Because if we're not going to be doing military interventions in the future, for the foreseeable future, then we've got to think about how we can exercise power in other ways. We should put the aid budget back up to where it was. We should, as David said, strengthen the UN, because they can operate in places we can't. We should be working with our European partners, not just with the Americans. We need to rethink a lot of that rhetoric in the integrated review published by the government a few months ago about Britain as an independent, sovereign operator, turning the dial on international crises. I mean, we have shown actually we're pretty impotent in a situation where the Americans take a decision. We have little choice but to follow.
And David, looking at the next step then, once Kabul had fallen, the response on the ground, particularly around the airport, has been fairly substantial from the United Kingdom. I've seen a lot of praise for the British troops out there, but perhaps questions asked over lack of leadership from Whitehall. What's your assessment of the situation and how the British government has responded after Kabul did fall?
Well, I think that we're in a very precarious situation, actually. I'd have to accept that this operation depends entirely on the consent of the Taliban. And so that deadline of the 31st of August, not much more than a week away now, should be staring us all in the face and speeding up our decision cycle. The actual operation, I've done a few of these non-combatant evacuation operations in my time, and this is the worst possible scenario when you are unable to clear space between the airhead and your possible threat, which is exactly what's happening now. They're right on top of people, and we've seen the tragic scenes coming out of Kabul airport. So it's not a good situation. With the Taliban's consent, it can go on really for as long as they wish. But as Peter said, the threat now of an attack from ISIS looms, and that would change the calculation altogether. If we were to reinforce it, do not think that's easy either. So we really are in hock to the Taliban, which makes me ponder and start, wishing to get people to start thinking about the strategy going downstream. And I think it's got to be a combination of carrots for the Taliban and sticks, as particularly in respect of any sense they might be tempted or required by their allies to harbour terrorist groups. But we really do need to start understanding what is the government's and what is the international community's future strategy towards Afghanistan and our relationship with the Taliban, because we're stuck if we don't, and we need to get on with it.
You mentioned carrots for the Taliban. What could those look like?
Well, I'm involved, for example, with a wonderful organisation called Plant for Peace, which has been, Peter will probably remember it, doing the rounds now since I think about 2008. And we thought the Afghan government was going to invest in it, which is an agrarian, sort of almost a revolution wrapped around pomegranate in lieu of opium, funny enough. And I understand that the Taliban have been briefed on it and are quite taken by the idea. If they behave, they'd get a lot of UN money to invest in this new concept. And I think that would be an example of the sort of input to a future Afghanistan economy and society that we should positively look at. And there's going to be other lookalike schemes, but this is a huge incentive to them to behave within international norms, governed no doubt by Sharia law. And we've got to understand the detail of that. There seems to be disagreement within the Taliban's ranks. But, if we can get them to see that there is a prospect of Western support as long as they behave, and that basically means tolerable interpretation of Sharia law plus no truck with terrorism, then I think that's the position we're now in, and we've got to probably pursue quite aggressively, because the alternative is pretty horrendous.
Finally, before I let you both go, Dominic Raab back in the newspapers today. What is your assessment, both of you, but perhaps starting with Lord Ricketts, of how the Foreign Affairs Secretary has responded to the crisis in Afghanistan? Should he have come back earlier from holiday, for example?
Well, I think he should, and I've no doubt that he regrets not doing so. But actually, this was a reflection of the way that the government was caught out by the speed of the Taliban advance. And one can argue that they should have known better, and that it was certainly clearer earlier. And at that point, Dominic Raab, I'm sure, should have come back. He'll be bitterly regretting the fact that he didn't. But it is a reflection of a wider malaise, I'm afraid, within Whitehall at the geostrategic level. I'd like to know, I think there's questions about the way the National Security Council is functioning and the National Security Staff, a job Peter did so well a few years ago. I think all that needs to be looked at very quickly and thoroughly, and there's going to be some big lessons to be learned about the way we run crises.
And Lord Ricketts, final word to you on Dominic Raab.
Okay, just to go back very briefly on what David said on the geostrategy, I think we've got to remember that China is now going to be the dominant country in Afghanistan. They will move into the vacuum. We've got to work with them as well as with the UN to try to have that sort of impact that David is talking about to keep the Taliban in order. I think that since the Prime Minister was going on holiday, if the Foreign Secretary had been asked by Number 10 to come back from holiday to be there to take over effectively the government while the Prime Minister was away, he should have done that. And I think the news that he seems to have delayed his return by a couple of days is very surprising. But the important thing is, yes, we now manage this crisis well, and let's hope that ministers learn the lessons and we are more rapid in responding to unforeseen events in future. We've got the machinery in Whitehall, we've got the able civil servants, we need the political leadership.